I thought I had found my dream home. It was everything I'd ever wanted, quiet, peaceful, and brand new. The kind of place people only hope to find, tucked away on the outskirts of town, far from the noise and the chaos of the world. The house was beautiful, perfect even. The floors were polished, the walls freshly painted, and the garden was manicured just enough to look charming but not overdone. It felt like it was made for me. I could already picture my life there, comfortable, serene, without a care in the world. What more could I ask for? But here's the thing, sometimes the perfect house isn't what it seems. What I didn't know at the time, what I couldn't have possibly known, was that this house wasn't just a place to live. It was something more. It was like it was waiting for me. No, not waiting, watching. Waiting for me to step inside, for the right moment to make itself known. And believe me, it didn't take long. It started with little things, whispers in the dark, creaks in the floorboards, a strange chill in the air at night. But that was just the beginning. I didn't know it then, but I was about to be pulled into something far darker than I could ever imagine. Something that would turn my dream home into a living nightmare. I had just moved into a beautiful, newly built home on the outskirts of town. Everything seemed perfect at first. There was a certain kind of peace to it, something you could almost feel in the air as soon as you stepped onto the property. The house stood tall and proud at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of city life. It was the kind of place you'd read about in magazines, the kind of house that made you believe that you could finally escape all the chaos, all the noise. You know the feeling when you walk into a place, and it just feels like home. That's exactly what I had when I stepped through the front door. It was like a fresh start, a clean slate. The floors were polished to perfection, the walls freshly painted with that unmistakable scent of newness in the air. The smell of fresh paint and wood, mixed with the faint traces of fresh plaster, made everything feel new, alive even. It was exactly what I needed after everything that had happened before. The perfect place to begin again. The rooms were spacious, and the light, oh the light, poured in through the large windows, bathing everything in this golden warmth. You could almost feel the warmth of the sun on your skin, even though the air outside had a slight bite to it. It was peaceful quiet, nothing but the gentle hum of the wind outside and the soft rustle of leaves in the trees. The kind of quiet that feels like it's almost waiting, as though the world has paused, holding its breath. I remember sitting in the living room for the first time, watching the sunlight dance on the wooden floors. The house felt still, but there was a certain energy to it, a quiet pulse beneath the surface. Maybe it was my imagination, but it was almost like the house itself was alive, welcoming me in. I unpacked my things slowly, carefully, savoring the feeling of being in a new place. I set up my books, arranged the kitchen the way I liked, and placed the little trinkets I had gathered over the years on the shelves. It was mine, or at least it felt like it was. I felt like I could breathe again. This house, with its newness and charm, gave me that. It was more than just a house, it was a symbol of my new beginning. It was everything I had hoped for. The walls were solid, unyielding, the kind you could lean on. The floors creaked softly as I walked through the rooms, the air thick with the warmth of freshly baked bread in the oven and the soft scent of jasmine from the garden. I couldn't help but think, this is it. This is the place I'll finally find peace. But as I moved through the house, a strange sensation began to creep in. Something about the stillness, the quietness of it all, was just a little too perfect. It was too empty. I started to think that maybe, just maybe, this house wasn't as perfect as it seemed. There was a weight to the silence that I couldn't shake. It was like there was something in the air, something unspoken, just out of reach. It wasn't the house itself, it was something about the way it felt. You know that feeling you get when you're somewhere and you can't explain why, but something just doesn't sit right with you? That was how I felt as I stood in the hallway, unpacking the last of my things. The house was quiet, sure, but not in a peaceful way. It was quiet in a way that felt like something was waiting, watching, waiting for something I couldn't yet understand. I shrugged it off. It was probably just me, still adjusting to my new surroundings, right? In the beginning, it was easy to brush off the little things, those small, unsettling moments that didn't quite add up. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, or maybe I was just being overly sensitive, still adjusting to the new surroundings. But after a while, the things I tried to ignore began to pile up. It started with the creaks, the kind of creaks that sounded like someone walking through the house, but when I'd check, there'd be nothing. I told myself it was just the old house settling, that it was normal. Houses creak, right? I even joked to myself that I had a ghost roommate. But the more I tried to laugh it off, the more the sounds began to feel intentional, like they were being made by something or someone that didn't want me to forget it was there. The flickering lights came next. At first, I thought it was the light bulbs or maybe a power surge, but the flickers were different. It wasn't the usual flash of a dying bulb. It was a stuttering, irregular flicker. It would happen at the oddest times, like when I was sitting down to dinner or reading a book late at night. And every time the light flickered, it was like the room would grow colder, just for a moment, but enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I'd shiver, pull the blanket a little tighter around my shoulders, and try to focus on something else, anything else. I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself it was just the wiring, or maybe my nerves. It wasn't anything real. But then the smells started. I know it sounds ridiculous, but they were real, strong, sudden smells that I couldn't explain. Sometimes it was the scent of something burning, but when I'd check, there was nothing. No candles, no stove left on, nothing. The air would just smell wrong. Or it would be something else, like flowers, sweet and heavy, but there were no flowers in the house, no reason for it. It wasn't the pleasant, comforting kind of smell. It was cloying, almost suffocating. Sometimes, I would catch a whiff of something metallic, like iron or rust, and it would linger, even when I opened the windows to air the place out. It was strange, unsettling, like the house itself was breathing in these strange smells, as if something in it was alive, something that was feeding off the air itself. It was during one of these nights, when the smell of something burning filled the air, that I began to hear the footsteps. They weren't loud at first, just soft, the kind of sound you might hear if someone was walking down the hall in socks. At first, I thought it was my imagination, or maybe I had left the window open and heard the wind. But the more I listened, the more I realized the footsteps were too consistent, too deliberate. They didn't sound like the house settling, and they didn't sound like the wind either. They were rhythmic, paced. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I sat in the dark, listening. Each step was followed by a faint, soft creak in the floorboards. I held my breath, waiting, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But there was something wrong about it. It wasn't just the sound. It was the pattern, steady, slow, deliberate. It was as if whatever was walking knew I was there, and was waiting for me to react. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in the house with me. I would get up to check, and of course there was nothing. The hallways were empty, the doors shut tight. But every time I went back to bed, I could still hear the faint creaking, the soft padding of footsteps on the floor, moving closer and closer to my room. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just the house's quirks, its imperfections. But deep down I knew it wasn't just the house. Something else was here. And then there were the cold spots. I don't mean the kind of chill you get when the heat is off for too long. These cold spots didn't make sense. It could be 70 degrees in the living room, but one part of the room would suddenly drop to freezing, like someone had opened a window, even though every window was shut tight. The first time it happened, I thought it was just a draft, but it was so much colder than it should have been. And it stayed cold for hours, even after I turned the heat back on. I would stand in it, try to warm up, but it felt like the coldness was seeping into my bones, like it was waiting, lurking just out of sight, biding its time. That's when I started to realize this wasn't just a house. It was something else, something alive. It was like it was aware of me, of every move I made. The cold spots would follow me, the shadows would shift in the corner of my eyes, the whispers would grow louder when I was alone. I could hear them, soft murmurs, too faint to understand, but their tone was unmistakable. It was like they were calling to me, coaxing me to come closer, to find out what was really waiting. And every time I tried to ignore it, every time I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, the house responded. It wasn't a place of comfort anymore. It was a place that was aware, and that awareness, it was growing darker. It was on the night of the storm when everything changed. The rain pounded against the windows, a low, constant roar, as though the sky itself were trying to claw its way in. The wind howled through the trees outside, bending them, making them creak and groan like something was trying to break free. It was the perfect night for the house to reveal its true nature, the night I would finally confront the terror that had been growing inside it. And for the first time, I couldn't brush it off. It wasn't just the flickering lights, the strange cold spots, or the unsettling whispers. No, this time it was something real. I was lying in bed, wide awake, listening to the storm rage outside. The sound of thunder cracked through the silence every few moments, rattling the windows, making the floorboards groan. I had been trying to sleep for hours, but the events of the past few days had left me too unsettled to rest. Every noise, every shadow, seemed magnified in the darkness. My eyes kept darting to the corner of the room where the shadows seemed just a little too thick, a little too deep. And then it happened. I heard the footsteps again. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, just the house settling, like I'd told myself countless times before. But these steps were different. They were slow, deliberate, heavy. They echoed through the hallway, one step after another, like someone was walking towards my room. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath caught in my throat. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. There was a silence, a pregnant pause, as if whatever it was waiting for me to move, waiting for me to open the door. My blood ran cold, and every rational part of me screamed that this was impossible, that I was alone in the house, that no one else was here. But then the door creaked. Slowly, almost as if it was being pushed open by unseen hands. My eyes locked onto the door, my body completely still, as the door slowly inched open. The cold air from the hallway rushed into the room, carrying with it the smell of something sharp, like rust or decay. My heart raced, and I tried to move, to get up and check, but I couldn't. It was as though the air itself had thickened, making it impossible to breathe. The footsteps came closer. I could hear them, feel them, as they came down the hallway, closer and closer, until I could almost feel their presence on the other side of the door. I thought I was going to suffocate right there. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, my hands trembling as I slowly reached for the doorknob. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind screaming for me to open the door, to face whatever was out there. But I couldn't. I just couldn't. Finally, the courage to turn the knob came, my fingers cold and slick with sweat. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and there was nothing. No one. The hallway stretched out before me, eerily still, the faintest light from the storm flickering through the windows. No footsteps. No shadow. Nothing. But that wasn't the worst part. As I stared into the dark hallway, my eyes adjusted to the gloom, and that's when I saw it. In the far corner, just beyond the edge of the light, I saw the faintest outline, like a figure, standing perfectly still. It was human, but it wasn't quite right. It was too tall, too thin, and the shape seemed to shimmer, like it was made of smoke or shadow. I blinked, thinking I was just seeing things. But when I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone. I slammed the door shut, my heart thundering in my chest, and locked it. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I pressed my back against the door, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. There was no logical explanation for what had just happened. The footsteps, the door opening by itself, the figure in the hallway. It couldn't have been real, but it was. And in that moment, I realized that whatever was in this house wasn't just playing tricks on me. It was showing me exactly what it could do. I was no longer alone in this place. I couldn't ignore what had happened. That figure, the footsteps, the coldness, they couldn't be explained away. I tried for days to convince myself that I had imagined it all, but I knew deep down that it was real. Something was wrong in that house. The quiet unease that had been simmering beneath the surface had finally reached a boiling point, and there was no going back. I needed answers. So, I did what anyone in my situation would do. I started digging. I asked around the neighborhood, trying to find anyone who knew anything about the history of the house. At first, people were tight-lipped. They didn't want to talk about it. The more I pressed, the more I realized that there were things they didn't want to say. But eventually, after days of coaxing and a little persistence, I got someone to tell me the truth. The house, it turned out, wasn't as new as I had been led to believe. Sure, the structure was new, the walls, the floors, the roof, but the land itself, the very ground beneath the house, was far older. It had once been home to a large estate, owned by a family that had long since disappeared. According to the local legend, the family had been involved in some strange practices, rituals, sacrifices, and dark, forbidden things. The house had been built to replace the old mansion that had burned to the ground in the early 1900s, but the land was still cursed. People in the town knew about it, but never spoke openly. The older generation, they were afraid of what had happened there, afraid to say too much. But the worst part was what came next. The property wasn't just home to a mansion. It had once been the site of a cemetery that had been abandoned when the mansion burned down. No one knew exactly when it had been turned into a graveyard, but the graves had been there long before the mansion even existed. The spirits buried in that ground had never truly been at rest, and the construction of the house had disturbed their eternal slumber. The whispers in the night, the cold spots, the footsteps, those weren't just random occurrences. They were the restless spirits of the dead, trapped in the earth, angry that their sacred ground had been desecrated. It was then that I learned the horrifying truth. The house was built on the grounds of an old cemetery. And the spirits, they weren't happy to have been disturbed. As I stood there, trying to process what I'd just learned, I could feel the weight of it settling over me. The house, the land, it wasn't mine. It was never meant to be. And now, I was the intruder. I had unknowingly crossed a line that should never have been crossed, and the spirits that lingered in the shadows were angry. Angry at me for disturbing their peace. I wasn't prepared for the next part of the revelation. The more I learned about the house's past, the more I started to notice odd things. Things I hadn't seen before, things I'd written off as trivial. I started to find strange symbols hidden in the corners of the house. At first, they looked like scribbles, hastily drawn markings that seemed to blend into the walls. But when I looked closer, I realized that they weren't random at all. They were ancient symbols, runes, sigils, symbols meant to ward off spirits, to trap them, or to bind them to the earth. Whoever had lived here before had been trying to keep something in the house, or keep something out. I found one of the symbols carved into the floorboards in the attic, hidden beneath a layer of dust. Another was scratched into the doorframe of the basement, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. It was as if the house had been built to keep these spirits contained, to keep their presence from spreading. But clearly something had gone wrong. The spirits had found their way back in, and they were not at all happy about being disturbed. Not by me, not by anyone. And then there were the old photos. I found them in a dusty box in the attic, tucked away in a corner. Most of them were black and white, faded with age, but one stood out, an old, tattered photograph of the original mansion. The house that had burned down all those years ago. The image was eerie. The mansion was imposing, dark, almost monstrous in its design. But it was the people in the photograph that caught my attention. There were several figures standing in front of the house, families, children, but one figure stood out from the rest. A tall man, dressed in black with hollow, empty eyes, his face obscured by shadows. He stood apart from the rest of the group, staring directly at the camera. And as I stared at the photograph, I could almost feel his eyes on me. It was like he was there, standing right behind me, watching, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the photograph was still watching me, that he had never truly left the house. I felt his presence, cold, oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest whenever I looked at that picture. The more I looked, the more I realized that the house had always been watching, waiting, and now it was waiting for me to make the next move. It was a night like no other. The storm had intensified, the wind howling with such force that it felt as if the entire world outside was being torn apart. The rain slammed against the windows in sheets, and the thunder echoed like the roar of a beast in the sky, shaking the house with every strike. I should have known that this night would be different, that something was coming, something worse than I had already experienced. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. I had locked all the doors, shut every window, and drawn the curtains tightly to block out the storm. The house, which had felt so suffocatingly still before, now felt like it was holding its breath. The air was thick, oppressive, as if the house itself was aware of the storm raging outside and of the storm brewing within. I tried to distract myself, reading a book in the living room, the dim light from a single lamp casting long, crooked shadows across the walls. But the house was alive. I could feel it. It was like the walls were closing in on me, like they were pressing on my chest with every breath I took. Every shadow seemed to stretch, warping and twisting unnaturally in the corners of my eyes. Then, just as the lightning struck, it happened. The first crash of thunder rattled the windows, and the lights flickered out. I sat in darkness, the only sound the furious storm outside. My heart thudded in my chest, my hands clammy on the pages of the book. I sat there, listening to the roar of the wind, my mind racing when I heard it. Soft at first, footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving down the hallway, just outside the living room. I stiffened, my breath catching. I had heard those steps before, so many times before. But this time, they were different. They were heavier, more deliberate, like something was dragging its feet across the floor, something with weight. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, the storm, anything but what I knew it really was. But then the door to the living room creaked. Slowly, painfully. I could hear the hinges groan, as if being forced open by something far stronger than the wind outside. My skin crawled. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. For a long moment, everything was silent. Then I saw it. A shadow, darker than the room around it, stretched across the floor. It moved, unnatural and fast, darting to the edge of the wall where the shadows danced impossibly long. It wasn't just the shadows anymore. They were alive. The darkness was no longer just a trick of the light. It was something that had substance, something that could move. Something that had been waiting in the corners of the room, watching me. I could see the shapes of figures flickering in the periphery of my vision. Shapes that shouldn't have been there, figures that shouldn't have existed. The storm raged outside, its fury filling the house with its crashing sound, but the sound was drowned out by something far worse, the sound of whispers. Faint at first, like they were coming from a distance, but then louder. Closer. The whispers were coming from within the walls, seeping into my ears, filling my mind with words I couldn't understand. But I felt them. They were calling my name. They were calling to me, and there was no way to shut them out. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I felt the oppressive weight of the room, like the air was thick with unseen eyes, staring at me from all directions. The shadows were moving, crawling along the walls, stretching unnaturally, as though they were alive. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, locked in place by the terror that had already seeped into my bones. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I tried to scream, but the sound was caught in my throat. My lungs burned for air, but I couldn't breathe. I could only hear the footsteps, closer, closer, coming toward me, the door creaking again, the dark figure stepping into the room. I finally forced myself to look up. The figure was standing there, just beyond the doorway. Tall, thin, faintly illuminated by the flashes of lightning. But it wasn't just a man. I could tell that now. It was something else, something wrong. Its face was hollow, like it had been hollowed out by years of decay. Its eyes black as ink, glowing faintly, reflecting the light from the storm outside. It stared at me, its presence suffocating, its gaze penetrating, as if it could see straight through me. And then it moved, slowly, deliberately, toward me, one footstep after another. I tried to scream, to move, but my body was paralyzed by fear. I was helpless. With each step, I felt the temperature drop, the air turning icy. The very walls of the house seemed to press in on me, the shadows around me growing darker, closing in. The whispers were louder now, coming from all directions, filling the room with their frantic urgency. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears, pounding so loudly that it drowned out the storm outside. The figure reached the center of the room, standing just inches away from me. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, its presence suffocating. My mind was racing, my chest tightening, as if the house itself was trying to swallow me whole. The figure reached out its hand, fingers long and skeletal, the nails jagged like claws. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It reached toward me, the air thick with the scent of decay, the walls whispering my name. And then, just as its hand brushed against my face, the storm outside reached its peak. The thunder cracked, and the lights flickered back on. The figure was gone. Everything was still. The house was silent again, the storm outside howling as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I knew it wasn't over. The terror I had felt, the suffocating presence, the whispers, they were still in the house. They hadn't left. And as I stood there, frozen in the center of the room, I realized that I wasn't just living in the house. I was living with it, and it would never let me go. I barely remember what happened next. My mind was a blur of fear, adrenaline, and confusion. I don't know how much time passed, but I know this: I couldn't stay. The house had become more than just a house to me. It had become a prison, a nightmare that I couldn't escape no matter how hard I tried. The spirits, the darkness, they weren't just figments of my imagination. They were real, and I had been foolish to think that I could live there without paying the price. I don't even remember how I got out of that room, out of that house. One moment, I was standing there, frozen in place, staring at that figure, and the next, I was running. My legs were shaking, my chest tight, my mind screaming, "Get out! Get out!" I didn't look back as I ran through the hallways, through the dark, empty rooms that had once felt like home, but now felt like a labyrinth of terror. I barely remember the drive out of the neighborhood. The storm was still raging, the rain pelting my windshield like tiny stones. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, far away from the house. Far away from that place that had held me in its grip. But even as I left, even as the house disappeared in my rearview mirror, I knew something had changed. The air in the car felt heavy, oppressive. The whispers were still in my ears, like they were following me, tugging at my mind. I thought I had escaped. I thought that by leaving, I could leave it all behind. But I was wrong. I couldn't run from it. The house had seeped into me, into my very soul, and it would never let me go. I moved into a new place, far away from the house. It was quiet, peaceful. But every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the whispers. Every time I passed a dark corner, I could see the shadows flickering. The whispers were there, faint but unmistakable. I would hear them when I was alone, when the lights were low. They weren't loud, but they were persistent. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore them, I couldn't escape them. They were always there, just on the edge of my hearing. It's been months now, but I still don't sleep soundly. I can't. I haven't been back to that house. I don't even know if it's still standing. But I do know one thing. I will never forget what happened there. I can't. The house, the spirits, whatever they were never truly gone. And I am haunted by that knowledge. I've learned to live with the fear, to ignore the whispers that follow me, even in the daylight. But some nights, when the storm is loud and the wind howls just like it did that night, I feel it again. The weight of the house, the presence, the darkness. It's like it's waiting for me to return, to make things right. But I won't. I can't. I wonder sometimes if the spirits ever found peace, or if they're still trapped in that house, waiting for the next person to disturb them. I don't know, and I don't want to know. All I can do is keep moving forward, hoping that one day the whispers will stop. But if you ever find yourself near that house, if you ever happen to pass through that quiet neighborhood on a stormy night, don't look too closely. Don't go near the house. Don't listen to the whispers that seem to come from within, because they'll find you just like they found me. And once they have you, they won't ever let you go. What do you think? Was it just a haunted house, or was there something far darker at play? What do you believe happened to the spirits that lingered there? Did they ever find peace? Or is the house still waiting for its next victim? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced something like this? Something that you couldn't explain away, no matter how hard you tried. And don't forget, if you want more true horror stories, don't forget to subscribe. Because sometimes, the scariest stories are the ones that never leave you. The ones that follow you long after the lights go out.